each drop carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken prayers. Sergeant Marcus Henley adjusted his collar against the October cold and pressed the brass binoculars harder against his eye sockets. Through the cracked lenses, the ruins of what had once been St. Bartholomew's Field Hospital emerged from the morning fog like a diseased tooth jutting from infected gums. "There she is, boys," Henley muttered to the 3 men crouched behind him in the shell crater. "Been abandoned for 6 months, they say. Orders are to investigate reports of movement inside." Private James Kellerman spat into the mud beside him, the brown saliva mixing with rainwater and something that might have once been blood. Movement? In a hospital that's been empty since the spring offensive? What kind of movement? Corporal David Ashworth, barely 19 but already bearing the hollow eyes of a man who had seen too much, shifted his bolt-action rifle across his knees. "Does it matter? Command wants us to check it out, we check it out. Same as always." The 4th man, Private Thomas Blackwood, said nothing. He had been silent since they'd left the forward trenches 2 hours ago, his pale blue eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. The others had learned not to press him. Shell shock took men in different ways, and Blackwood's way was silence. Henley lowered the binoculars and studied the structure before them. St. Bartholomew's had been built in the early days of the war, when men still believed this conflict would be over by Christmas. It was a long, low building of reinforced concrete and steel, designed to withstand artillery bombardment while providing medical care to the endless stream of wounded that flowed back from the front lines. Now its white-painted walls were stained with rust and worse things, and several of the windows had been blown out by shell fire. But it was intact, mostly intact, and according to the reports that had filtered up through command, there had been lights seen moving through those broken windows at night. Candle flames, the observers had said, dancing in patterns that made no sense. "Right then," Henley said, checking his Webley revolver one more time before holstering it. "Standard formation. Kellerman takes point, Ashworth covers the rear. Blackwood, you're with me in the middle. We go in, we look around, we report back. Nothing fancy." They moved across the cratered landscape in the practiced crouch of men who had learned to live below the horizon. The mud sucked at their boots with each step, releasing pockets of gas that had been trapped beneath the surface for months, sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a grave. As they drew closer to the hospital, details became clearer. The main entrance had been barricaded from the inside with furniture and medical equipment. Beds, surgical tables, and cabinets had been piled against the door in a haphazard wall that spoke of desperation rather than military precision. But there was a side entrance, a loading dock where ambulances had once delivered their cargo of broken men. The metal door hung partially open, revealing only darkness beyond. Kellerman raised his hand and the patrol stopped. He pointed to the ground near the entrance. In the mud, barely visible beneath a thin layer of fresh rainwater, were footprints. Bare feet, from the look of them. Too many to count, overlapping and crisscrossing in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. "Whoever's been here, they've been coming and going regular-like," Kellerman whispered. "Look at the wear patterns." Henley nodded and gestured for them to continue. They reached the loading dock without incident. The smell that drifted from the open doorway was unlike anything Henley had encountered in 4 years of war. It was not the simple stench of death and decay that permeated every battlefield. This was something else, something organic and wrong, like bread that had been allowed to rot in a sealed container. Inside, the hospital was a maze of overturned gurneys and scattered medical equipment. Surgical instruments lay scattered across the floor, their metal surfaces dulled by a thin film of something that might have been dust or might have been mold. The walls were covered with a network of dark stains that seemed to pulse in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. But it was the sound that stopped them in their tracks. A low humming, barely audible, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. It rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost musical, like a lullaby sung by voices that had forgotten how to properly form words. "Jesus Christ," Kellerman breathed. "What is that?" Quiet, Henley hissed. He strained his ears, trying to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, as if the walls themselves were singing. They moved deeper into the hospital, past empty wards where rusted bed frames stood like skeletons in the gloom. The humming grew stronger, and with it came other sounds. The soft shuffle of bare feet on concrete, the whisper of fabric against skin, and underneath it all a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. In what had once been the main ward, they found them. 43 men in hospital gowns sat perfectly still on the edges of rusted bed frames, their backs straight and their hands folded in their laps. Each wore a wooden mask carved in the image of a stern, bearded face. The craftsmanship was crude but effective, the features rendered in broad strokes that somehow conveyed both authority and infinite weariness. The masks were held in place by leather straps that had been pulled so tight they cut into the flesh of the wearers' skulls, leaving dark channels where blood had dried. The humming was coming from behind those wooden faces, a harmonic vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones. As the patrol watched, frozen in the doorway, one of the figures slowly turned his head toward them. The eye holes of the mask were empty, revealing only darkness beneath. "Welcome, brothers," the figure said, his voice muffled by the wood but carrying clearly through the ward. "Father has been waiting for you." The other masked figures began to turn their heads as well, a slow, synchronized movement that made their leather straps creak in harmony. Soon all 43 were facing the doorway, their empty eye sockets fixed on the 4 soldiers. "We are the children of the 100 Fathers," another voice said, then another, until the words became a chant that filled the ward with echoing syllables. "We are blessed. We are chosen. We are home." Henley found his voice first. "Who are you? What happened here?" "We were sick," came the reply from multiple throats. "We were broken, but Father came to us in our pain. He showed us the truth beneath the wood. He gave us new faces, clean faces, faces that would never age or rot or betray us with false expressions." One of the figures stood, moving with the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed the motion countless times. Henley could see now that the leather straps holding the mask in place had been sewn directly into the skin, the thread disappearing into infected wounds that wept clear fluid. "You are tired, brothers," the standing figure continued. "You have walked far through the mud and the rain. Father has prepared places for you here, beds with clean sheets, masks that will fit your faces perfectly. You need only sleep, and when you wake, you will be home." Ashworth raised his rifle, his hands shaking. "Stay back, all of you. Just stay where you are." The masked figures tilted their heads in unison, the gesture somehow conveying amusement despite their wooden faces. "There is no need for weapons here, young brother. This is a place of healing. Father would not permit violence in his presence." "Your father," Henley said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Where is he?" Every mask turned toward the floor. "Below," they whispered in harmony. "Always below, in the deep places where the earth knows its true name. He tends the roots of the great tree, the one that grows downward into darkness. Each mask is carved from its wood, each face blessed by its sap." The humming grew stronger, and Henley realized it was not coming from the masked figures alone. It seemed to be rising from the floor itself, from somewhere beneath the concrete foundation, a deep, thrumming vibration that made the metal bed frames sing like tuning forks. Blackwood, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly stepped forward. His rifle clattered to the floor as he raised his hands to his face, fingers exploring the contours of his cheeks and jaw as if he had never felt them before. "Tom," Henley called sharply, "get back here." But Blackwood was already walking toward the nearest masked figure, his movements dreamlike and fluid. "I know you," he said softly. "I've seen you in my dreams. You were there when the shells fell at Passchendaele. You held my hand when I thought I was dying." The masked figure extended its arms in welcome. "Yes, brother. We have been waiting for you to come home. Father speaks of you often. He has prepared a special place for you, deeper in the earth, closer to his roots." "No!" Kellerman lunged forward and grabbed Blackwood by the arm, trying to pull him back. But the moment his skin made contact, something changed in his expression. His eyes went wide, then calm, then closed entirely. When he opened them again, they held a different light. "Oh," Kellerman whispered. "Oh, I understand now. Why didn't you tell me it would be so peaceful?" He released Blackwood's arm and turned to face his companions. "You have to feel it," he said urgently. "The connection. It's like being part of something vast and ancient and good. All the pain, all the fear. It just goes away when Father touches your mind." Henley drew his revolver and pointed it at Kellerman's chest. "Step away from them, James. That's an order." "Orders," one of the masked figures said sadly. "Always orders. Commands from men who have never felt the weight of wood against their skin, who have never heard Father's voice in the deep places. Put down your weapon, brother. There is no authority here but love." The humming intensified, and Henley felt something tugging at the edges of his consciousness. A warmth that started in his chest and spread outward, loosening the knots of tension in his shoulders, easing the constant ache in his war-worn joints. For a moment, he almost lowered the gun. Then Ashworth fired. The shot echoed through the ward like thunder, and one of the masked figures toppled backward, a hole punched clean through the wooden face. But instead of blood, a thick, amber sap leaked from the wound, and the humming grew louder rather than stopping. "Brother," the fallen figure said, sitting up as if nothing had happened. The hole in its mask was already beginning to close, the wood flowing like liquid to seal the gap. Such anger. Such fear. Father will tend to these wounds as well. Ashworth worked the bolt of his rifle with shaking hands. "What are you? What are you?" The masked figures began to stand, all of them moving in the same slow, deliberate fashion. As they rose, the humming changed pitch, becoming something that was felt rather than heard. A vibration that seemed to resonate with the very bones of the earth. "We are what you will become," they said in unison. "We are the peace that comes after surrender. We are the children of the 100 Fathers, and each face is a prayer carved in living wood." Blackwood was now standing among them, no longer distinguished from the others except by his lack of a mask. But even as Henley watched, one of the figures was approaching him with something cupped in its hands. A mask, smaller than the others, carved with features that looked disturbingly like Blackwood's own face. "No," Henley snarled, raising his revolver. But before he could fire, Kellerman tackled him from behind, and both men went down hard on the concrete floor. "Don't hurt them," Kellerman pleaded as they struggled for the weapon. "Please, Marcus, you don't understand. They're not the enemy. They're trying to save us." The gun went off during their wrestling match, the bullet ricocheting off the ceiling and embedding itself harmlessly in the far wall. In the moment of distraction that followed, Ashworth tried to run for the exit, but found his path blocked by masked figures who had moved with impossible speed and silence. "Running, young brother?" one of them asked gently. "But you have only just arrived. Father has been so looking forward to meeting you." Ashworth spun around, looking for another way out, but the masked figures had formed a circle around all of them. They stood perfectly still, their wooden faces tilted slightly upward, as if listening to something only they could hear. "He is coming," they whispered together. "The eldest, the first to surrender, the one who showed us that the flesh is weak, but the wood is eternal." The humming stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that Henley could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Then, from somewhere beneath the floor, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, measured steps that seemed to shake the entire building with each impact, A section of the concrete floor near the center of the ward began to crack, hairline fractures spreading outward in a perfect spiral pattern. The cracks widened, and through them seeped a thick, golden substance that caught the pale light filtering through the broken windows. The footsteps grew louder, and the floor began to bulge upward as if something massive was pressing against it from below. The masked figures knelt as one, their wooden faces turned toward the rising mound of cracking concrete. "Father comes," they chanted. "Father rises. Father blesses us with his presence." The floor exploded upward in a shower of concrete fragments and that strange golden sap. From the hole that was revealed, a figure began to emerge. It was tall, impossibly tall, and had to bend almost double to fit through the opening in the floor. Its body was covered in bark-like skin that shifted and flowed like living wood, and its face was a massive version of the masks worn by its children, but carved directly into the flesh. But it was not alone. As it rose, other figures began to follow. Dozens of them, each wearing a different version of the wooden face, each moving with the same slow, deliberate grace. Some were tall, some short, some broad, some thin, but all bore the same carved features, the same empty eye sockets, the same expression of infinite patience. "The 100 Fathers," Kellerman breathed, and his voice was full of wonder. "They're all here, all of them, come to welcome us home." The first and largest of the figures stepped fully into the ward and surveyed the scene with those hollow sockets. When it spoke, its voice was like the groaning of ancient trees in a windstorm. "My children," it said, and every syllable seemed to resonate with the authority of centuries. "You have done well. The lost ones have been brought home, just as I knew they would be." It turned its attention to Henley, who was still struggling to free himself from Kellerman's grip. This one fights the embrace of peace. He clings to the pain of flesh, the agony of mortality, but I see the wounds in his spirit, the cracks where my love can enter. The father reached out with one enormous hand, fingers like gnarled branches, and touched Henley's forehead. The moment that barkskin made contact, images flooded his mind. Visions of endless trenches filled with rotting corpses, of friends blown apart by artillery, of nights spent weeping into muddy blankets while shells screamed overhead. But then the images changed. The trenches became peaceful gardens where wooden figures tended rows of strange, luminous plants. The corpses rose and were given new faces, carved with expressions of eternal contentment. The screaming shells became a symphony of harmonious voices, all singing the same wordless song. "Do you see?" the father asked gently. "Do you understand what I offer? An end to suffering, a family that will never abandon you, a face that will never betray your pain with unwanted expressions." Henley felt his resistance crumbling like a sand castle before the tide. The warmth that had been tugging at his consciousness earlier now flooded through him completely, washing away years of accumulated trauma and grief. For the first time since the war had begun, he felt truly at peace. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, I see." The father nodded and gestured to one of the other wooden figures, who approached carrying a mask carved in Henley's own likeness. The craftsmanship was perfect, every line and angle captured with impossible precision, as if the carver had known his face better than he knew it himself. "Sleep now, my son," the father said as the mask was lowered toward Henley's face. "When you wake, you will be home." The last thing Henley saw before the wood covered his eyes was Ashworth, still standing alone in his circle of kneeling figures, his rifle lowered and his face slack with the same expression of wondering surrender that had claimed them all. Then there was only darkness, and the sound of his own breathing echoing behind the mask, and the warm sensation of leather straps being pulled tight against his skull. He felt the needle and thread as they began to sew the mask permanently to his flesh, but there was no pain. Only the gentle pressure of love being made permanent. When he woke, He was lying on a clean bed in a room he had never seen before. The walls were carved from living wood, and luminous sap dripped slowly from the ceiling to pool in small channels that had been cut into the floor. Other beds filled the chamber, each occupied by a masked figure resting peacefully. Henley sat up and felt the weight of his new face. The wood was warm against his skin, and through the eye holes he could see with perfect clarity despite the fact that no light source was visible. His hands moved automatically to explore the contours of the mask, and he felt the places where it had been sewn to his flesh. The stitches were neat and precise, and the wounds had already healed completely. "Welcome home, brother," said a familiar voice. He turned to see Kellerman in the next bed, his own mask freshly attached. "Father says we can rest as long as we need to. There's no hurry anymore, no orders to follow, no wars to fight." "How long have I been sleeping?" Henley asked, and his voice sounded strange coming from behind the wooden face, muffled and resonant at the same time, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "Time moves differently here," Kellerman replied. "Father says it's been 3 days in the world above, but down here it could be minutes or months. The wood doesn't age, so neither do we." Henley looked around the chamber more carefully and realized that it stretched much further than he had first thought. Row after row of beds extended into the distance, each occupied by a masked figure. Some were clearly recent arrivals, their hospital gowns still dirty from the world above. Others wore clothing from earlier periods of the war, or even earlier than that, and a few were dressed in styles that seemed to come from decades past. "How many of us are there?" he asked. "Father says we are approaching the sacred number," Blackwood's voice answered from somewhere behind him. Henley turned and saw his former companion approaching, wearing a mask that had been carved with features that were somehow both his own and utterly alien. 1,000 souls, each wearing a face carved from the great tree. "When we reach that number, Father says we will be ready for the next phase." "The next phase?" "The spreading," Ashworth said, appearing on Henley's other side. His mask bore the expression of a child, despite his adult body. "When we have enough brothers, we will return to the world above. We will visit the trenches and the hospitals, the command posts and the supply depots. We will offer the gift of peace to everyone who suffers." Henley nodded slowly. It made perfect sense. Why should they keep this blessing to themselves when there were so many others in pain? The war had created millions of wounded souls, all desperately in need of the healing that only Father could provide. "But first," Kellerman said, "we must learn to be proper children. Father will teach us the songs of the deep places, the rituals of the root and the branch. We must understand our new nature before we can share it with others." As if summoned by their conversation, the floor began to thrum with that familiar vibration, and the golden sap in the ceiling channels began to flow more freely. The Father was coming. He emerged not from below this time, but from the living wood of the walls themselves, his massive form simply stepping out of the bark as if it were no more solid than water. Behind him came a dozen other figures, each bearing the carved face of patriarchal authority. "My children," the Father said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "You have rested well. Now it is time for your first lesson." The masked figures in the beds all sat up in unison, their movements perfectly synchronized. Henley found himself moving with them, his body responding to some signal he couldn't consciously perceive. "You must forget the names you bore in the world above," the Father continued. "Names are chains that bind you to a past filled with suffering. Here, you are simply children, beloved children of the 100 Fathers." Henley tried to remember his name, but found that it slipped away from him like water through his fingers. Marcus something, or had it been Michael? The harder he grasped for it, the more elusive it became, until finally there was nothing left but a vague sense that he had once been called by a different sound. "Good," the Father said, and somehow Henley knew that his thoughts had been observed and approved. Names create separation. Without them, we are united in purpose and spirit. One of the other wooden patriarchs stepped forward, carrying something that looked like a bundle of branches. As it unwrapped them, Henley saw that they were not branches at all, but human arms and legs that had been transformed into wood, complete with tiny carved faces at the joints. These were taken from those who resisted too strongly, the patriarch explained in a voice like rustling leaves. Their pain was so great that it infected their limbs, turning flesh to bark, bone to heartwood. But even in their transformation, they found peace. See how they smile? Indeed, each of the tiny carved faces bore an expression of serene contentment. The arms and legs moved slightly, flexing at their wooden joints, and from each small mouth came a whisper of that familiar harmonic humming. "This is what happens to those who fight the embrace of love," the father said. "But you, my newest children, have surrendered willingly. Your transformation will be different, gentler. You will retain your human forms, though your hearts will beat with the rhythm of the great tree." He gestured, and more patriarchs emerged from the walls, each carrying wooden tools that gleamed with that golden sap. Chisels and hammers, saws and files, all carved from the same living wood as their faces. "It is time for your masks to be refined," the father announced. "The rough carvings that allowed your initial transformation must now be perfected. Each face will be adjusted to reflect your true nature, your deepest self, your role in our great family." The patriarchs moved among the beds with practiced efficiency, selecting individuals seemingly at random. When one approached Henley, he felt no fear, only curiosity about what improvements might be made to his wooden features. The patriarch's hands were surprisingly gentle as they explored the contours of his mask, fingers tracing the carved lines with the skill of a master craftsman. "This one was a leader in the world above," the figure murmured to itself. "He carried the weight of others' lives, the burden of command. His face must reflect wisdom earned through suffering." The chisels began their work, and Henley felt the vibrations as his wooden features were reshaped. There was no pain, only a pleasant tingling sensation as his mask was gradually transformed. He could hear similar work being done on the other recent arrivals, the soft sounds of carving accompanied by whispered consultations between the patriarchs. "Your jaw must be stronger," his craftsman explained as he worked, "to show the strength needed to guide others. Your eyes must be deeper, to reflect the profound understanding you will gain. Your mouth must be set in lines that speak of compassion tempered by necessary firmness." As the modifications continued, Henley found his perspective shifting in subtle but important ways. The chamber around him seemed to make more sense, its organic architecture revealing patterns and purposes he had not noticed before. The other masked figures were not simply random individuals, he realized, but carefully chosen components of a larger design. Each mask bore features that reflected a specific role in the underground community. Some were carved with the soft lines of eternal children, meant to remind the fathers of innocence and joy. Others bore the stern features of judges and teachers, their purpose to maintain order and pass on wisdom. Still others showed the weathered faces of workers and builders, marked by long years of patient labor. And then there were the masks like his own would soon become, the faces of leaders and guides, carved with expressions that commanded respect and conveyed authority. These were the faces that would one day return to the world above, not as conquerors but as shepherds, leading the lost and wounded down into the healing darkness. "It is finished," his patriarch announced, stepping back to admire the completed work. "Rise, my child, and see your true face." Henley stood and moved to one of the polished metal surfaces that served as mirrors in the chamber. The face that looked back at him was both familiar and utterly transformed. His features had been refined and idealized, made more perfect than they had ever been in life. The carved wood seemed to glow with inner light, and his eyes appeared infinitely deep and wise. But more than the physical changes, he could feel the difference in his very nature. The constant anxiety that had plagued him throughout the war was gone, replaced by a calm certainty about his purpose and place in the world. The guilt over decisions made and men lost had been carved away along with his imperfect human features, leaving only a clear sense of duty to his new family. "Beautiful," whispered one of his fellow children, and he turned to see that the others had also been transformed. Each wore a mask that was perfect for their individual role, yet all were united by the same fundamental expression of serene authority. The father nodded approvingly at his children's transformations. "You are ready now for the deeper teachings. Come, follow me into the root chambers. There is much you must learn about the true nature of this war." They moved through corridors carved from living wood, passing chambers filled with masked figures engaged in various activities. Some tended gardens of strange, luminous fungi that grew in neat rows along the walls. Others worked at looms, weaving fabric from fibers that seemed to be spun from golden sap. Still others sat in circles, their wooden faces tilted toward each other as they shared the harmonious humming that served as their primary form of communication. The root chambers were vast caverns that stretched far beyond the reach of the sap light. Ancient trees grew here, their trunks so massive that their bark formed walls and their branches served as bridges between different levels. The roots of these giants plunged deep into the earth, disappearing into chasms that echoed with the sound of distant water. "Behold the true battlefield," the father said, gesturing toward the enormous trees. "While men fight their petty wars on the surface, the real conflict takes place here, in the deep places where life and death struggle for dominion over the earth itself." As Henley's transformed eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, he began to see movement among the roots. Figures moved through the shadows, some wearing the familiar wooden masks, others bearing faces of living bark that seemed to shift and change as he watched. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice now carrying the resonant authority that his new mask provided. "The first children," the father replied. "Those who found us in the earliest days of the war, when the gates of hell first opened and the earth began to bleed. They have been with me for 15 years now, tending the deep gardens, preparing for the great flowering that is to come." One of these ancient children approached them, moving with the fluid grace of something that was no longer entirely human. Its mask was carved from wood so old it had turned nearly black, and its eyes glowed with the same golden light that filled the sap channels. "Father," it said in a voice like wind through autumn leaves, "the deep roots report unusual activity. The enemy grows stronger in the lower chambers. They have begun to sing their own songs, trying to corrupt the harmony we have built." The father's wooden features somehow managed to convey concern despite their fixed expression. "Show us," he commanded. They followed the ancient child deeper into the root chambers, past groves of smaller trees whose trunks bore carvings of human faces frozen in expressions of ecstasy and terror. The carvings moved slightly as they passed, mouths opening and closing in silent pleas or prayers. At the very deepest point they could reach, where the roots of the great trees converged in a massive tangle, they found the source of the disturbance. The wood here was diseased, its golden sap turned black and viscous. From the infected areas came a different kind of humming, discordant and harsh, like the sound of machinery grinding against stone. "The heretic legions have found us," the father said grimly. "Their corruption spreads even here, in the deepest sanctuaries. They seek to turn our children against us, to plant seeds of doubt and rebellion in minds that should know only peace." As if summoned by his words, shapes began to emerge from the blackened wood. They wore masks as well, but these were carved from bone and metal rather than living wood. Their faces showed expressions of twisted joy and malicious humor, and their eyes burned with fires that hurt to look upon. "Brothers," one of them called mockingly, "how long you have hidden in your wooden wombs, pretending that surrender is strength, but the true fathers call to you now." the fathers of pain and glory, of blood and iron. Come, taste the freedom that lies beyond the mask of false peace. The father stepped forward, his massive form casting shadows that seemed to move independently of his body. You have no power here, creatures of the upper fires. This is a place of growth and healing, not destruction and chaos. The bone-masked figure laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Growth? Is that what you call it? We see only stagnation, father of lies. Your children wither in their wooden faces, never growing, never changing, never truly living. We offer them something better, the mask of flesh, ever changing, ever perfect, ever hungry for new experiences. More of the heretic figures emerged from the corrupted wood, their bone and metal faces glinting in the saplight. They moved with predatory grace, and Henley could see that their bodies were not simply human forms, but amalgamations of flesh and machinery, of organic tissue and forged steel. Your newest children seem uncertain, one of them observed, looking directly at Henley and his companions. They remember the taste of blood, the thrill of violence, the joy of causing pain. Wooden faces cannot contain such memories forever. Eventually, they will crack, and when they do, we will be waiting. Henley felt a strange stirring behind his mask, a warmth that had nothing to do with the golden sap. Images flashed through his mind, memories of battles fought and won, of enemies cut down, of the savage satisfaction that came from surviving when others did not. For a moment, his wooden features felt constraining, artificial, false. But then the father's voice filled his mind, drowning out the heretical whispers. Peace, my child. Remember why you chose this path. Remember the pain that drove you to seek shelter in our embrace. The creatures of chaos offer only temporary pleasure followed by eternal torment. We offer eternal peace preceded by temporary sacrifice. The warmth faded, replaced by the familiar calm that had become his constant companion. Henley looked at the bone-masked figures with pity rather than temptation. They were like wild animals, driven by hungers they could never satisfy, trapped in cycles of violence that would ultimately consume them. You are too late, the father told the heretical intruders. These children have already chosen their path. Their faces are carved, their fates sealed. You have no claim upon them. We shall see, the bone-masked leader replied. When the final war comes, when the surface world burns and the deep places are flooded with blood, your wooden children will remember what they truly are. And when they do, we will welcome them with open arms. The heretical figures began to retreat back into the corrupted wood, their harsh laughter echoing through the root chambers. But before they disappeared entirely, their leader called out one final time. Ask your precious father about the others, wooden children. Ask him about the 99 who came before him, and what became of them when they realized that peace is just another word for death. Then they were gone, leaving only the stench of burnt metal and the sound of grinding machinery fading into the distance. The father stood motionless for a long moment, his wooden features unreadable. Pay no attention to their lies, he finally said. The creatures of chaos speak only to sow discord and doubt. There are no others, no 99. There is only one Father, one path, one truth. Come, let us return to the surface chambers. There is much work to be done. But as they made their way back through the root chambers, Henley found himself wondering about the heretic's words. He tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the harmony of his wooden face and the peace it brought him. But deep in his mind, a small voice whispered questions he could not entirely silence. What others? What 99? And why did the father's denial sound almost like a prayer? The surface chambers seemed different when they returned, though Henley could not immediately identify what had changed. The golden sap still flowed in its channels, the masked figures still went about their peaceful activities, and the harmonious humming still filled the air. but underneath it all he sensed a tension that had not been there before. Other children approached them as they walked, their wooden faces turned toward the father with expressions of concern. They spoke in whispers, using the abbreviated communication that their masks made necessary, but Henley caught fragments of their conversations. The roots grow restless. The deep songs change their tune. Some of the old children have begun to ask questions. The father acknowledged each concern with a nod or a gentle touch, but his movements seemed more hurried than usual, as if time were becoming a factor in calculations that had previously been eternal. They reached the main chamber where Henley and his companions had first been transformed, but now it held far more beds than before. Hundreds of masked figures lay in perfect rows, their wooden faces turned toward the ceiling where new channels had been carved to carry the golden sap. The air thrummed with their collective breathing, a rhythm that seemed to match the pulse of some vast, hidden heart. "The gathering accelerates," the father murmured, more to himself than to his companions. "Each night brings new children to our threshold. Each dawn sees more faces carved and claimed. Soon we will have the strength needed for the great revealing." But even as he spoke, Henley noticed something troubling. Not all of the masked figures lay peacefully in their beds. Some sat upright, their wooden faces tilted toward the walls in attitudes of listening. Others stood at the edges of the chamber, motionless but somehow alert, as if waiting for a signal that only they could perceive. "Father." One of the ancient children approached, its black mask gleaming dully in the saplight. "We have discovered something in the deepest archives. Records that predate your arrival here. They speak of others who came before, who tried to build what you have built." The father's massive form went utterly still. "There were no others. I am the first and only. The tree has always been mine to tend, the children mine to guide. The records say differently." The ancient child's voice carried no accusation, only the patient persistence of one who had learned to speak truth regardless of consequences. "They tell of 99 attempts to create perfect families beneath the earth. 99 fathers who carved masks and gathered children, who promised peace and delivered transformation. All failed. All were consumed by the very corruption they sought to escape." Around the chamber, the masked figures began to turn their heads toward the conversation. The harmonious humming faltered, replaced by a silence so complete that Henley could hear the distant dripping of sap in the root chambers far below. "Show me," the father commanded, his voice carrying an edge that had not been there before. "Show me these lies carved in dead wood by forgotten hands." They descended through passages that Henley had not seen before, corridors that seemed older than the rest of the complex. The walls here were not carved from living wood but hewn from stone, and the surfaces bore marks that spoke of great age and careful abandonment. No golden sap flowed here, and the only light came from phosphorescent fungi that clung to the ceiling in patches of sickly green illumination. The archive was a vast chamber filled with wooden tablets, each one carved with symbols and images that hurt to look at directly. The ancient child led them to a section where the tablets were arranged in neat rows, their surfaces covered with a script that seemed to writhe and shift in the fungal light. "Here," the child said, indicating a tablet near the center of the collection, "the record of the 98th father. He called himself the Shepherd of Sorrows, and he gathered children just as you do, gave them wooden faces carved from a great tree that grew in the deep places, promised them peace through surrender, love through transformation." The father reached out with one massive hand and touched the tablet. The moment his bark skin made contact with the carved wood, images began to flow from the surface like water. Pictures of masked figures dancing in circles around a pit filled with golden fire, a tree of impossible size whose roots extended into caverns that seemed to go down forever. And at the center of it all, a figure that looked exactly like the father, but wearing a mask carved with features of infinite sadness rather than stern authority. He lasted longer than most, the ancient child continued. Nearly a century of peace and growth before the corruption found him. It came from within, as it always does. One of his children began to remember what lay beneath the mask, began to question the wisdom of surrender. The doubt spread like a disease, and soon all of his carefully carved faces were cracking, revealing the rotting flesh beneath. More images flowed from the tablet, the masked figures tearing at their wooden faces with clawed fingers, trying to remove them only to find that the masks had grown into their very bones. The great tree withering and dying, its golden sap turning black and poisonous. The father himself, standing alone in a chamber filled with the corpses of his children, his own mask beginning to crumble away to reveal something that was no longer recognizably human. In the end, the ancient child said softly, he did what all the others had done. He carved a new mask for himself, one that would let him forget what he had seen, what he had done. He became his own first child, and the cycle began again. The father stepped back from the tablet as if it had burned him. Lies. Fabrications created by the enemies of peace to sow discord among the faithful. I am not like the others. My tree is different, my children chosen more carefully, my masks carved with greater skill. But as he spoke, Henley could see cracks beginning to form in the bark of his skin. Thin lines of light leaked through, revealing something luminous and terrible beneath the wooden exterior. The father's voice, too, began to change, taking on harmonics that suggested vast age and accumulated despair. Besides, the father continued, his tone becoming almost pleading, even if the others failed, their mistakes teach us how to succeed. We will not make their errors. We will not allow doubt to take root. We will be perfect in our surrender, absolute in our peace. The ancient child tilted its head, the gesture somehow conveying infinite patience and endless sorrow. But Father, don't you remember? You said those same words when you first arrived here. You said them while carving your own mask, while burying the memories of what you had been before. You said them as the 101st cycle began. The father's mask began to crumble in earnest now, pieces of carved wood falling away to reveal a face that was both familiar and utterly alien. It was human in basic structure, but the features were wrong, as if someone had tried to carve a man's face from memory and had forgotten crucial details. The eyes were too deep, the mouth too wide, the nose a mere suggestion of flesh over hollow bone. No, the father whispered, his voice now carrying the weight of centuries. No, I chose this. I chose to forget. I chose to begin again. The peace was real. The love was real. The masks worked. They worked for years, for decades. They worked until they didn't. The ancient child agreed. Just as they worked for the 99 before you. Just as they are beginning to fail now. Look around you, Father. Look at your newest children and see the cracks already forming. Henley became aware of his own reflection in the polished surface of another tablet. His wooden mask, so perfect when first carved, now showed hairline fractures around the eyes. Through the cracks, he could see his own flesh beneath, pale and somehow wrong, as if it had been too long without sun or air. Around him, his fellow transformed soldiers were experiencing the same revelation. Kellerman's mask had split completely down one side, revealing an eye that wept tears of golden sap. Ashworth's wooden features were sliding slowly down his face like melting wax, exposing patches of skin that had turned the color and texture of bark. Blackwood stood perfectly still, but his mask had begun to emit a low humming sound, as if something were trapped inside it and desperately trying to get out. The cycle must complete itself, the ancient child said with something that might have been compassion. The children must remember what they truly are. The father must face what he has done. Only then can the next iteration begin. Above them, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the stone passages. The great tree was dying, its roots withdrawing from the earth as its leaves withered and fell like golden snow. In the chambers above, hundreds of masked figures were awakening to the knowledge that their faces were prisons, that their peace was a lie, that their father was just another lost soul desperately trying to forget his own nature. The father looked around at his crumbling children and his failing creation, and for a moment his ruined features showed something that might have been recognition. But then he reached into his robes and withdrew a chisel and hammer, tools carved from wood so dark it seemed to absorb light. "Then we begin again," he said with the certainty of someone who had spoken those words many times before. "We carve new masks, gather new children, build new chambers in the deep places. The cycle is not failure, it is refinement. Each iteration teaches us more about the nature of perfect surrender." He raised the chisel to his own face and began to carve, shaping new features over the ruins of the old. With each cut, his memories seemed to fade, his recognition of his true nature disappearing behind layers of self-imposed forgetfulness. The ancient child watched this process with the patience of one who had witnessed it countless times before. "Will you help us?" the father asked as his new mask took shape. "Will you gather the tools and prepare the chambers? The next group of children will arrive soon, and they will need guidance, will need love, will need faces that will never betray them with unwanted emotions." The ancient child nodded slowly. "As we have always helped, Father. As we will always help. Until the day comes when someone finds the strength to break the cycle rather than simply repeat it." But even as it spoke, Henley could see the cracks beginning to form in the ancient child's mask as well. The black wood that had seemed so permanent, so perfectly fitted to its wearer's skull, now showed the same hairline fractures that marked all the others. Whatever force had kept it stable for so long was finally failing, and soon it too would face the choice between remembering and forgetting. In the chambers above, the sound of screaming had begun. Not the screams of pain or fear, but something worse. The screams of those who had been given a glimpse of perfect peace and were now having it torn away, leaving them more lost and broken than before. Some of the masked figures were clawing at their faces, trying to remove the wooden features that had become part of their very bones. Others simply sat in their beds and wept tears of golden sap, mourning for a contentment they had never truly possessed. A few, the strongest or perhaps the most damaged, had begun to move toward the exits. They walked with purpose despite their crumbling masks, driven by some instinct that told them the only escape lay in the world above. They would return to the trenches and the battlefields, carrying with them the memory of failed peace and the knowledge that even in the deepest places, there was no true sanctuary from the war. The father completed his new mask and stood, his features once again showing the stern authority that had first drawn his children to him. He looked around the archive as if seeing it for the first time, his newly carved eyes showing no recognition of the tablets or their warnings. "Come," he said to Henley and the others, his voice once again carrying the resonant certainty of absolute conviction. "We have work to do. There are chambers to prepare, masks to carve, children to gather. The great tree awaits our tending, and the roots grow restless without proper guidance." Henley felt the pull of that voice, the same compulsion that had first drawn him to surrender his human face for one carved from wood. It would be easy to forget what he had seen, to let his own mask heal and cover the cracks that threatened to reveal the truth beneath. It would be peaceful to become once again a simple child in need of guidance rather than a broken soul carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. But as he looked at the ancient child, still watching with those patient, sorrowful eyes, he found himself wondering what would happen if just once someone chose differently. What would happen if instead of forgetting or fleeing, one of the father's children chose to remember and stay? What would happen if the cycle were broken not through escape but through acceptance of the truth it was designed to hide? The golden sap had stopped flowing in the channels above, and the great tree's roots were withdrawing deeper into the earth, seeking some new place where they might take hold and begin the cycle anew. Soon this chamber would be empty, its tablets covered with dust and fungus until the next father arrived to discover them and be horrified by their revelations. The ancient child would remain as it always remained, waiting with infinite patience for the day when someone would finally choose to break the pattern rather than repeat it. In the meantime, there were new trenches being dug in the world above, new hospitals being built to tend new wounds, new soldiers marching toward new battles with their faces still naked and unprotected by wood or bone or any other mask. They would come seeking shelter from the storm of war, seeking peace in the deep places, seeking fathers who would give them new faces and promise them that the pain would end. And the cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would, until the day when someone found the strength to look behind all the masks and see the truth that lay beneath them all. The truth that there was no peace to be found in forgetting, no love to be discovered in surrender, no family that could heal the wounds that war had carved into the human soul. The father was already moving toward the stone stairs that led back to the surface chambers, his new mask bright with fresh carving, his voice beginning the familiar litany of comfort and promise that would draw new children to his embrace. Behind him, Henley and the others followed, their own masks cracking and healing in an endless rhythm of revelation and concealment. In the archive, the ancient child remained alone among the tablets, its patient vigil continuing. Somewhere in the deep places, roots were already seeking new soil, and the sound of carving tools echoed faintly through chambers that would soon be filled with fresh faces and renewed hope. The war above continued its grinding progress through the mud and blood of no man's land, creating new wounds that would need new masks to hide them. And in the space between revelation and forgetting, in the moment before the cycle began anew, something that might have been laughter or might have been weeping echoed through the stone corridors, carrying with it the accumulated grief of 100 failed attempts at peace and the promise of 100 more to come.